Welcome to this roundtable on art and peace education. For this roundtable, I'm with experts, scholars, artists, activists. I have the chance to be with Tony Jenkins, who is, of course, teaching this notion of peace education and art. He's going to introduce himself better than what I'm saying. Thank you so much, Tony, for being here. We have Tarrie, who is the head of Tomorrow's Woman. It's an amazing program for peace building, and she will also tell us more about it. And David Cottrrell, who is an artivist, really working with the defense and art, and he is telling us all about how art for him is a way to create peace building. But please, Tony, you can open this discussion, introducing yourself and telling us more about your work in relation to peace education through art, please.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So a little bit about me. I'm a full-time day job is a professor of justice and peace studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. But I also am the managing director of the International Institute on Peace Education and the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education. So these are two global networks with a broad mandate of advocating for peace education and training educators to teach for peace. So to talk about specifically about how art is incorporated into our work, I think I could talk about a lot of things. I could share with you a little bit about how different members of our networks use peace education as tools of transformation. But I think I'd like, if you can bear with me here, to get a tiny bit theoretical, because I think it's good to have some grounding to understand why it's so important to our field more broadly. So when I talk about peace education, the central problematic for us is violence, and it comes in all different forms and manifestations, direct violence of war, structural oppression, cultural violence. And I want to add to this list the idea of epistemic violence, which is something that is particularly insidious in the way it manifests itself, particularly in educational spaces, right? And it poses these kind of hegemonic systems of knowledge, of beliefs, of traditions, of language, of ways of being that are really kind of rooted in this sort of colonialist logic. And this kind of violence results in the silencing of voices, of histories, of cultures, of ways of being and thinking, particularly of non-dominant and marginalized groups of people. And this is a big issue for us because this, colonizer logic shapes our world. And the original kind of application of this epistemic violence as a colonizing tool was pretty intentional. It was used as a means of control, right? So it shapes views, limits perspectives, limits our ability to engage in different peace building practices, and it also limits our thinking and education. And it continues through various unconscious biases, and it's kind of sustained through practices of neocolonialism. So I want to get to art here, because the manifestations of this violence are problematic. It creates a number of false binaries and hierarchies. It privileges, the mind over the body, rationality over intuition and affect, human over non-human, amongst other things. And further, the problem extends to not just what is known, but how we know it and how we teach it. So, if we think about the context in which I work in a university setting, my universe, privileges cognitive and analytic modes of being and learning. And so, it's the analytic is ways of knowing a privilege over the effect, the emotional intuitive, as I mentioned a second ago. And these other ways of knowing aren't reflected in our space of learning. And as a result, for most people, the learning feels really incomplete. In education, how we feel gets invalidated. Our intuitions, when something just doesn't feel right about what is being learned or taught, aren't considered, and they're not considered valuable forms of knowledge in those spaces. Right. When you think of educational spaces, we tend to require us to sit in chairs inside really sanitized spaces, disconnected from the worlds that we inhabit. So peace education invites us to engage in different modes of decolonization as a way to kind of confront this hegemony. And this is where the arts is so important, right? Inviting us into processes that elicit transrational thinking, where the rational is brought into balance with other modes, the affective, the embodied ways of learning, Art is really good in our work in particular at bringing in body learning, from breath work to social work to theater work and so forth. So without tapping into these more creative ways of knowing, our possibilities for facilitating change and enacting new modes of social and political organization, they're basically unlikely. So we have to find ways to kind of free these modes of thinking through harnessing our skills and capacities of imagination. And the last thing I just want to mention is this imagination is so important to what we do in peace building, because it is really a futures-oriented kind of work. And so we do a lot of imaging work in peace education. So it may not sound like a direct manifestation of art, but it is a creative application towards that end. It's something that we all do. We all image. We carry these impressions within us, fragments of pictures of sights, sounds, smells, feelings. Some of these things represent real or maybe even imagined events from our past. And sometimes they represent hopes and dreams for our future. And art can be a really powerful way of manifesting and sharing these images. And so in peace ed work and our peace building work, one of the things that we really focus in on is how we can harness art as a way of creating focus imaging of our personal and social futures. And so from the view of psychology and sociology, we understand in particular that human beings construct realities in their minds before they end up acting on it externally. So, I think, the arts, as you all probably likely know better than me, are really integral to helping us transform the way we perceive ourselves and others in the world around us, right? It can elicit that kind of self-understanding, nurture empathy, serve as a vital tool from healing from trauma, as known one of your other sessions addresses, and, helps us to express and share reflections and emotions that are sometimes too difficult for us to express in words. So that's kind of how I ground my thinking a little bit about the role of peace education and the arts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tarrie, could you tell us a little bit more about your work and how it's linked to peace education, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And Tony, you really sort of laid the groundwork for very much our work. So I'm Tarrie Burnett. I'm the executive director for Tomorrow's Women. We're based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we are celebrating our 20th anniversary of doing this peace building, peacemaking work. We specifically work with young women ages 15 to 29 who are Israeli Jewish, Arabs living in Israel, Arab 48 as they like to call themselves, and then also Palestinians who live in the West Bank and in Gaza. And then we also really connect our work because we care about creating global citizens who care about peace and justice in the world to our work right here in northern New Mexico. So we work with high school young women as well. And we're a dialogue-based organization. And then we use creative and therapeutic art as a methodology to transmute a lot of the intense emotions that come up during dialogue. So our work starts in northern New Mexico. We'll bring 16 young women to Santa Fe, and they will sit in almost 40 hours of facilitated dialogue. And this is led by staff who are Israeli Jewish and Palestinian, up and down. We really care about a co-model. It's important to us to represent the very work we're trying to do. And so we see art as really key in the emotional transformation of these intense identities and feelings and stereotypes that come up in this work. And I can share more as we continue on.
Definitely. Thank you very much, David. Maybe you can introduce yourself also for us to understand where, the language, the artistic language comes from, especially regarding the scholar approach and this, I would say, very practical approach that Tarrie developed.
Thank you. It's fascinating to be part of this conversation. I'm a visual artist, so a trained fine artist. I work as a research professor for Sheffield Hallam University, and I'm director of a research institute, which is the arts and humanities portion of that university. But I think the relevance to this conversation is that as an artist, I broadly, you might classify it as installation art, includes moving image, photography, but also sculptural forms. I've been privileged to use the ambiguous role of the artist as a way to become an independent observer in conflicted landscapes, and sometimes have the opportunity to reveal narratives and subjective kind of experience which is not covered by the broader analysis or the existing way in which those landscapes or communities or moments are being portrayed through journalism or through, kind of macro narratives which attempt to try and give us some form of understanding. I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2007 as an independent war artist, accountable to a health charity, Wellcome Trust, but allowed full access, uncensored, to the medical care pathway in Helmand province. And the extraordinary thing really for me was that nobody really knew what the artist was for. It certainly wasn't me there to try and kind of fix anything or to try and help anybody, but there was a romanticism around the idea of the artist, which meant that people projected onto me whatever they wanted it to be, whether they imagined I'd be painting something which would go in the officer's, kind of regimental home, or whether I would be there, providing something which would help them explain what they'd been to their families when they went back. In reality, the most important thing was that I was able to stop and watch and to develop conversations with people which were not instrumental. They weren't necessarily part of a structure of line management or of a need to try and deliver any particular task. My challenge, as all artists' challenge, was to develop the justification for the work that I wanted, the contribution, as well as make the contribution. And that allowed me to decide there were some aspects of my experience that I hadn't felt were represented to me before I got there. There were things that, despite the amazing coverage of war and conflict that we absorb from childhood through to adult life, I felt completely that there'd been a failure of empathy through the existing forms of representation and the conventional forms of language. Maybe we've just got too familiar with them, or maybe it's because what was happening was we were offered an illustration of other people's suffering rather than empathetic understanding of how that would affect our lives. And I came to believe that the arts are vital, not only in facilitating dialogue, but also in interrupting narratives and challenging kind of maybe a complacency that we feel that we have the tools to describe something which is incomprehensible, not by providing a better representation of it, but by providing examples of experience and empathy that are not being transmitted through the material that we assume that has given us that portrait.
Thank you very much, David. You're bringing in something very important, this notion of lack of empathy, that arts, with the connection and the link that is supposed to bring, is a revelator, a vector. So I would like to share this little video that will present tomorrow's woman in a very different way, and I'd like Tarrie to comment on it regarding the type of artistic techniques you're using with your audience. Let's have a look on it.
Like an ambush. Okay, come on. 1, 2, 3.
The mission of the program is to really uplift young women's voices, to advocate for peace, advocate for justice. Tomorrow's Women offers a year-long program for Israeli and Palestinian youth. The program starts in New Mexico with an immersive camp. This is a really big deal, what they're coming together to do, to listen, to speak, feel, and create. I'm Magdalena Karlik. I am the art director for Tomorrow's Women, an international organization based in the Middle East and in New Mexico in the US. We use art materials, poetry, movement, storytelling, dialogue, journaling to support the campers in the conversations that they're having about the conflict.
Being a Palestinian means no freedom, no safety, no life, no human rights. Being a Palestinian means living in a war all the time. Being a Palestinian is proud.
I'm Jewish and I belong to my country and my community. אני יהודייה ואני משתייכת למדינה שלי ולחברה שלי.
That's what makes me me. זה מה שהופך אותי להיות אני.
But as humans, we all belong to love, and that's what makes us connected and belong to each other.
Art and creativity have a huge role and place in conflict transformation. Through this exploration, they are holding so many big emotions, challenges to their nervous system and their belief system. It's not about equality, it's not about kumbaya. It really is about seeing inequity and feeling about it and then doing something about it. That work is hard for anybody, and they're teenagers. When they leave here, they will have an embodied sense of belonging, formed from being together. It didn't exist, and then it showed up. And then from that to create movement and murals. It's just so profound that that flow is in us all. And when we come together in a group, we can even create more. It's pretty incredible.
Thank you so much for sharing that video. I think it really gets at a theme that's coming up with Tony and David about empathy. And as you can see, these two very disparate communities come together. And really, we think about three communities. It's both Palestinians who live in Israel and also in the West Bank are having an encounter for the first time. And it's through these different methodologies, whether it's mural making or public art, and also, not just visual arts, right, but also poetry and writing and movement. They come out as friends, and it's no small thing to be able to disrupt, generations of narratives and identities, to come together in 3 weeks. And it's just the beginning. So we become a touchstone for these young women who stay with us for decades. But it really starts with both the dialogue and that sort of empathy making, and then the transmutation of those really intense feelings through our art.
Thank you, Tarrie. I would like to hear Tony about this notion of our type of artistic techniques, and especially how art could be used in the 5 spheres of peace education.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share a few things here. There's a lot I could kind of cover again. Our work through the Institute and the campaign is primarily about creating spaces for exchange and for shared learning of various transformative pedagogies and modes of learning. So what I'd like to do is sort of highlight a few of these things. So for example, in 2005, one of the focus of our institute was educating for peace through the arts, and we partnered with the organization Feminist Artists of the Mediterranean and Rhodes, Greece. You're just looking here at one of the posters, obviously trying to illustrate how we can kind of visually transform these kind of war images into peaceful images. But I could talk about a lot of different methodologies. I want to highlight a few here. One of the things that emerges in a lot of our work is the use of performance-related art. Obviously, really important and effective form of popular and non-formal education we see outside the classroom. We borrow from a lot of different techniques and methods that come from Augusta Boal's Theater of the Oppressed work, which is a really important form of community-based education that uses theater as a tool for social change. These tools are obviously really important in contexts where there is little or no tolerance for open dialogue or dissent. And a lot of different techniques and methods that come up here: image theater, form theater, and visible theater. Actually, what you're seeing here on the screen is an example of playback theater. It's hard to see, obviously, when a still shot what's happening there. But this is a performance by our colleagues of the organization Hamable at our institute in Mexico City last summer. And playback theater is an interactive kind of form of improvisational theater in which audience members tell stories from their lives and they watch them get enacted on the spot. It could be particularly a powerful way of helping us to get a different perspective on our own experience and embody it in a way that goes outside of our rational ways of thinking. Just for what it's worth, I got my start in peace education utilizing theater of the oppressed work in maximum security prisons, working with prisoners using some of these tools to help them uncover their own experiences of oppression and sources of their violence. Another methodology that comes up a lot is obviously the work of community art, and as Tarrie shared some examples of. So this is an illustration of our partners' work in Mexico City, the organization Colectivo Tomate. They create community projects that build peace through participation, dialogue, and art. And these community-based murals bring artists and neighbors together, and they create murals that are born from their personal, family, and collective histories. And engaging this art is a way of kind of connecting that in a different way, but it's also a way of creating a sense of belonging in these communities. And it's a really powerful tool to help them reappropriate various public spaces. Another example is from our colleagues in Colombia. We work with a great organization called Fundación Escuelas Paz. This is an illustration of work that they were doing with children who were living in conflict-affected areas controlled by the FARC. This is particularly from a program called Music, Art, and Memory, Youth Transforming the Social Fabric. So they were obviously using workshops to teach peace-building skills through the arts. I have to share one little anecdote because there can be you can use art as a tool of politics too. So maybe 10 years ago, I was visiting and working with our colleagues there, and I had an opportunity to meet with the Ministry of Education to try to shape and influence some policy related to peace education. And they expertly facilitated this meeting by bringing these ministry representatives into a room with their teachers, and they had them just sit down at the table with these blank mandalas sitting there with different colored pencils with no instructions, and their teachers and the ministry officials just sat and meditated and slowly began to color in these beautiful shapes. And it transformed the nature of the conversation. It brought them into a space of politics that engaged different ways of being that are, so traditionally confrontational when we think about the ways in which we engage in politics. So yeah, I just want to share these few short examples to give you kind of a diversity of ways in which we can utilize in formal and non-formal kind of contexts. The art is a really powerful tool of peace building. Maybe the last plug I'd throw out there for people who aren't familiar with it, there is a wonderful organization called the International Network of Museums for Peace. And it's been around for 20 years or so now, and it aims to build obviously a global peace culture by strengthening the work of museums that focus on peace and promoting a culture of peace through how they display, collect, and interpret peace-related material. And they have a great conference coming up that will be held in Sweden in August with the theme of museums as peacekeepers for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for the sharing of those very important images. David, I know that you wanted also to share with us this notion that you developed of trying to reviving empathy through some very striking images.
Yeah, it's interesting, and there's so many correlations with the work of Tony and Tarrie. And I also am working in maximum security prisons at the moment, just ironically, and I've also been working in Mexico quite a lot over the last couple of years. I will show you just a couple of images. They're all from a single project, but it's the one that I referenced which started me out in this way. And if I just try and share the screen now. There's so much to say on this subject. Currently I work on curatorial projects. I work in theatre, in visual arts, in a whole range of different ways. Look at different methods and modes to try and bring people together. But I still believe in the role of the individual artists as well as a parallel form of inquiry. I think the reason why this became so important to me was that project I mentioned in Afghanistan, when I found myself entering into a landscape that was extremely familiar in many ways through the media. I found that there were several things going on. One was the fact that my images looked like everyone else's. You know, there's a kind of certain drama to what was going on. But the second thing was that I recognized that those images were failing completely to help me understand what was going on, and that I had seen the most horrific images I can imagine. They took great joy in showing me things they found on the internet of horror to try and harden me up before I got there. But when I first saw somebody injured, or not actually injured, but they had been injured, and I found them coming into the operating theatre, they were being prepped, they were talking. I found that I felt like I wanted to collapse, and it was strange. I think because the image in my head had been one that was conditioned to somebody screaming or somebody unconscious, I hadn't imagined somebody negotiating. And for that point, I realized that the empathy was not something which I had felt through those images, despite feeling sensitized to this environment. I created a set of images like these, which you can see here, which were novel not for the quality of the images or the theatricality, but they were important because they showed something which at that time was impossible to show in the UK. So as an artist, I was allowed to carry a camera, compose an image, and I was allowed to defend my gaze and protect myself from revealing how shocked I was by what I was seeing, by the obstruction of the camera. But the important thing was that I was also allowed to access something which, since the Falklands conflict in the UK, had been banned from public consumption, which was actually to see British wounded or killed in the press. And that was because the fear of governments at that point was that they would lose consent for the war. If people can't empathize with war, they can't feel the horror and the tragedy of it, then they will allow it to continue. And you can't engage in violence against another human being unless empathy is lost. As soon as you empathize with somebody else, it's almost impossible to try and violently attack them. So the breach in empathy was vital, not for the continuation of the individual violence that makes part of a war, but also for the violence of a society to tolerate the fact that a war is happening on foreign shores without that being something that is impossible to comprehend and should be unpalatable. So the work that I showed was actually representing things which were the things that were most resonant to the patients and soldiers, which was about the ambiguity, the 10-hour flights, the sensory deprivation, the confusion that happens after self-administering morphine, and realizing that you're probably going through a transition where you will wake up with an entirely different identity as a patient in Europe or the UK or America, but your last memory is being at the peak of your fitness, believing that you're involved in something. So I produced things that couldn't be shown on television. So 8-hour films with virtually nothing to see because you're in darkness and overwhelmed by the sound of the engines that were in immersive theaters. Or I made things which showed the multiple views of the same experience, which could never be viewed on television, which showed the fact that there is no single narrative for a simple event. But there was one other thing, and I hope I'm not talking too long, just very briefly. There's the opportunity as an individual to feel that actually the most important thing in this case was not what looks best on camera. It was the thing which actually we don't have the language to represent. There's a great truism that war is about 5% of violence and 95% waiting. What I hadn't realized was the thing which torments most people after war is the waiting. It's the ambiguity of not knowing. When we tell a story, we have a beginning, middle, and end. When you're in the middle of it and you have no idea what's coming next, that heightened sense of dread and fear and never knowing if it will end is something which actually causes a lot of trauma. So as an artist, I was able to say, I'm not accepting the 300 words, The Guardian. So I think one of the things that I came to believe is important about artists is that there is a certain freedom that we have to not only can I create the message, but also to decide the format. I met many journalists when I've been in conflict zones that talk about the book they want to write when they retire, which is all the stories and all of the ambiguity and the complexity which can't be digested by their editor within a newspaper article. There is a continuous problem where many people feel that the language they're given to describe an experience isn't adequate for the experience itself. And with an artist, we had the freedom to decide, well, we would change the format to fit the experience to some extent. It often means when you talk about small details, but it does mean that you can suggest where the languages we have are inadequate. So I believe in the role of the individual in challenging the idea that we have enough ability to describe something which is related to someone else's lives, or even to be able to process the things that we've experienced ourselves. However, it was interesting that while I put on the exhibition at the Wellcome Trust, I had a hard drive full of images which hadn't existed in that form for about 30 years in the UK, because it had been illegal for journalists to take these images, and where that trust hadn't been placed. I went to each of the soldiers and each of the wounded people that I'd seen in the operating theatres and asked them what should happen to these images. The assumption was that a vulnerable person, as a patient, the image should be destroyed or anonymized, and I offered that option to them. It took 9 months or so to find them because the Ministry of Defence wasn't that keen on me tracking everyone down. By the time I met them, most of them felt anonymous already, and universally all of them asked to have a copy of the photographs, and for the photographs to exist, and for them to be in the public domain. And the strange thing was that for them, the photographs offered a way to rebuild a narrative that had been lost, a transitionary narrative, and to make sense of the transformation that had happened to them individually. But more importantly, when they were back in a civilian community of people that had never experienced what they had gone through, there was a possibility that they might be confronted with the reality of an experience which they had managed to keep out of the mind's eye and which hadn't interrupted their evening meals. So with these images already out, we went to the Department of Health and we got the agreement that soldiers and civilians in conflict will have access to their own patient records, documentation of their own treatment for the first time. And we went to the Ministry of Defence and we got agreement that the censorship rules would be lifted and journalists would be allowed to demonstrate, to document and show the wider horror of war rather than purely the suffering endured by people that were not from the home country. The artist's role was not necessarily to change policy, but by allowing a lay observer, an independent, into an existing structure to ask obvious questions or naive questions even, it was possible to have those brought back onto the table and have people reconsider the assumptions they've made and actually maybe change policy. For me, that emboldens my idea of what the arts could be. And since that time, I've been setting up an organization called Empathy and Risk, working as a curatorial organization, not only facilitate artists as investigators, but also, as is mentioned by Tony and others, the possibility of the arts creating safe spaces for unconventional dialogues, which allow equitable space for people, whether they're in government or whether they're activists or whether they're people that have witnessed conflict, to try and challenge the failures of the existing assumptions.
Thank you very much, David. So what we see is that not only art could be useful for peace building, but art could prevent conflicts. And this could be also a way to better understand the impact. This is going to be my last question. Tony, do you think art could be an efficient tool to prevent conflicts?
It's an interesting question, and the framing of efficiency is one that I was spending a lot of time thinking about last night when you shared these questions with us. I'm not sure that prevention or conflict transformation are maybe terribly efficient things. I think working through conflict is a relational process, right? Whether it's interpersonal, intergroup, cultural, international. All right, and to transform conflict or prevent conflict requires us to have the presence of healthy, constructive relationships that are rooted in understanding and empathy and so forth. And so the work is obviously a long-term process. It requires a lot of patience, the building of trust. But I do think art, being one of the essential tools amongst many that we can utilize to kind of foster these connections and understanding and empathy, I believe it to be probably more efficient than the more rational approaches, which are kind of stymied by various worldview obstacles, which art can help us move past and through. And I think the other side of this is another dimension of this is that art is particularly effective, and I guess it would be okay to say efficient in the ways in which it's able to nurture social aesthetics, right, which can contribute to the establishment of sustainable peace cultures, which is kind of a cornerstone of conflict prevention, right? So like researchers, for example, have been looking at existing peace cultures, and what they've seen is the most prominent features that kind of emerge in these cultures are the presence of things like non-warring norms, followed by non-warring rituals, non-warring values, and things like security, interdependence. And so the arts comes in particular in supporting the presence of these non-warring values and symbols and rituals and myths for peace, which help kind of establish this important foundation for positive reciprocity. You know, it makes those peace values explicit, and can really reinforce those values and the unity and commitment to peace that are so important to being able to prevent conflicts.
Thank you very much. Tarrie, did you ever impact, measures for women after following your program in terms of peace building? Do you think it had prevents some conflicts later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the interpersonal level, without a doubt, I think it's efficient and effective. I think you can bring groups together in really powerful ways very quickly. And, we see that in our program, 3 weeks, to people that we've heard stories from some of our young women who came because they had an agenda. They wanted to impart their narrative on the other side. And this was they saw this as an opportunity to do it. But then at the end of 3 weeks, very much based on our art methodologies and curriculum, they are not only they're friends and they're partners, and they have continued on to work together. Some of our young women are, working for the Harvard Negotiation Project. They've started, bi-national, bicultural preschools, really getting at that early education. They're doctors, lawyers, they're journalists. So for us, it's track to diplomacy, right? It's long term, but I think in terms of the international conflict level, conflict prevention, but at the interpersonal level, absolutely.
Thank you. See, art is really very powerful and gave hope. That's what we really want in terms of conflict resolutions. David, you will have the last word of this roundtable regarding this tool for conflict resolution, weapon, shall we say, against war. What would you like to tell us to conclude this roundtable, David?
There's so many things you could say, but I think for me, most conflict is a symptom of a failure of dialogue and a failure of empathy. It's when a community breaks down and no longer sees solidarity amongst itself, but allows for polarization to happen, whether that's through forces internally or externally. Art can be a catalyst for a conversation. It can bring people together either by creating a space where people feel they're experiencing something as a shared experience, or where it's interrupting a narrative and existing flawed kind of form of conversation by injecting a new idea. I think it's vitally important to continuously challenge impasse within conversations. And I think it's important to demonstrate the fact that we always need to be curious about the fact that things are more pluralistic and there are more perceptions experiencing the same event than we could possibly imagine. Art, with its focus on subjectivity, is constantly revealing a perspective which we may not have witnessed ourselves, or which we may not have prioritized within the hierarchy. And that hopefully breeds a humility in dialogue, which means that we were willing to listen to each other, as well as simply push forward our own assumption of what people believe.
Thank you very much for those beautiful and very, inspirational thoughts. All of you three, thank you for being part of this World Forum for the Arts, and to prove that art is a very important tool for peace education.